Hello, welcome to Recovery Demystified, a show where we explore our relationship to substances from a radical, non-religious, and empowering lens. Our sobriety is not a purity contract. It is an invitation to become curious about ourselves and find our own unique paths to growth and healing. If you've been questioning the role of alcohol or drugs in your life and haven't found the resources that you need, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Hello, welcome back to Recovery Demystified. My name is Early. I'm so happy to have y'all here today. Today I have another interview episode. This one is with Armstrong, and he talks about having a weed addiction, which I'm so grateful that people are starting to open up and talk more about that, because I feel like there's this idea that like weed is just harmless and you can't get addicted to it. And like, while it doesn't have a lot of the same health repercussions, like it doesn't make you stop breathing like opiates, and it doesn't, trash your liver the way alcohol does, it still has like really serious effects on people's lives. And Armstrong also talks about his experience with weed and psychedelics and getting into like a strange mental state that could be described in any number of ways. Some people would call it a psychosis, some people would call it, like a spiritual awakening, or it all depends on how you're looking at it. But he talks about being in a weird place existentially and having that be a result of smoking a lot of weed and taking a lot of psychedelics like in large amounts and mixing things together. So this is something that is super common and not talked about enough. And I'm super grateful that he came on the show to talk about his story today. And also, he's someone that just like randomly emailed me because he heard my Addicted Mind episode. Y'all, I love getting emails from you all. If there's ever a random stranger from the internet not using AI, just like typing a normal email, I fucking love getting those. So yeah, the email's info@recoverydemystified.com. And if you want to connect, that is one of my favorite ways to do that with you all. Also, speaking of connecting, I did make a free tier on the Patreon and created a chat for people that want like more mutual support from like-minded folks. So if you're interested in that, hit up that link down in the show notes and join us on Patreon in our new little group chat. And as always, if you get anything out of this show, it would be extremely helpful for me in the spirit of reciprocity if you would hit the subscribe button, rate and review. And speaking of that Patreon, there is also some paid membership options on there as well, and that helps support me being able to continue to make the podcast. Super grateful to have you all here today, and without further ado, here is my episode with Armstrong. Hello, Armstrong. How are you doing today?
Hello, I am having an all right day today, but I've sort of been, working up to the fact that I am giving an interview right here. So I've been nervous, but passable, I guess, all in all.
Yeah, it makes sense to be nervous. I think that basically everyone is at least a little bit nervous. Will you start by introducing yourself to the audience? Let them know your pronouns and just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so in this context, I go by Armstrong. People would usually call me he and him, but I guess you could branch out, mainly if we talked about it. Was there a third question?
Yeah, just tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
A little bit about myself. I'm a human person in my early 30s living in Europe. What would I say? I've been in some sort of recovery in various sort of steps and phases of such a journey since my early 20s, since the first time I realized sort of, okay, I'm using something, cannabis was the thing, and to a degree, like I can't stop was the impression I had. So since that point, it's been a series of rich developments that have been all over the place. And I guess we'll get into that more as we proceed.
Yeah, we're here today to talk about your story with addiction and recovery. So I'm curious what it was like for you to be a little kid, maybe some of your first encounters with substances, when things got bad, and then ultimately where you're at today. So yeah, start wherever you'd like.
Yes. Grew up sort of internationally, sort of between two or three countries, and between parents and sort of switching families, and not a huge amount of moving, but I was sort of back and forth until I started school. And then even during my school years, I moved country. So there's that.
Why did you move so much?
Just because one of my parents moved from one country to another, and so both of my parents wanted to have me around, let's say it like that. And then one of my parents also moved from the Americas, and so there was also visiting family and stuff like that a lot in my childhood. So just being between cultures, I mean, overall, I would point to that as a sort of part of who I am. I guess they have the term of a third culture person, where you're sort of between, I wouldn't even know how to explain it, but you're sort of between cultures and a bit of an outsider by default from that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to ask how that felt as a kid. Like if it felt normal, or if it felt dysregulating, or like you said, did it make you feel like an outsider? What was your perception of it when you were little?
I'd say that as a child, it's primarily the only point of reference you have. So in that sense, I would say it felt normal. I mean, certainly looking back upon it, if you keep moving from like one preschool to another and between languages, and I'm an outsider in terms of like being a local. Like locals in the places I've grown up are like, they've been in like one place for all of the time, and it's a very different perspective that they have, and they like belong, and like they know the dishes, and they know the dialect, like the cultural, like the food dishes, I mean, and the dialects and all sorts of things. So I've always been a little exotic. I mean, certainly less than other people in terms of ethnicity and stuff like that, but always sort of stuck out like a sore thumb to some degree.
That makes sense. I feel like I hear that a lot about people's experience in childhood. It's like kind of no matter what's happening, it sort of feels normal at the time. And then when we reflect on it in adulthood, it's like, oh, that's where this like pain point comes from, or that's where this stickiness still is with me. What else happened in your childhood?
There were elements of violence from like, it was in my sort of parental guardian, not towards me really, but among the adults, and verbal abuse type things. And that certainly, I mean, took me a little bit out of the sort of, let's say, more happy, carefree. I was the oldest of my sibling constellation. I mean, I still am. And I was, in a sense, the most mature, and sort of also always had a tendency to intervene. And then there was a little more violence also from my step parent towards my half siblings. And even as I matured, I felt I mean, I would try and intervene sometimes, and I was very emotionally involved in the like fights and like between my caregivers in that context. I think so that had a big impact on me, because it was, I would say I came from a bit of a, childish, innocent state, and that sort of impacted me because it was horrendous and wasn't anything I could do. So that definitely killed the mood a little bit as I was, I don't know, maybe 6 years and older.
Wow. So you were 6 years old trying to mediate violence in your family?
And I'd say that the brunt of it, being a perceptive human and sort of just by default, being sort of neurologically attuned to the adults in my life and family unit, they would have these discussions, like these looping discussions, and like, sort of volleying of guilt towards one another. So I was sort of following this like some sort of a movie, but I have such in a sense to this day, I have such a visceral sense of the arguments that were being had and like sort of trying to figure it out. And then as a teenager, and then even as a younger adult, I at some junctions intervened even physically, and certainly even at 10 to 12 years of age, I was saying like, please don't do this, don't be doing this, and stop, and I don't like it, and stuff like that.
That's really scary as a kid. And everything you're talking about is like where trauma is born in the body, like describing it as watching a movie and feeling like you have no control. Like that's really scary. And that's stuff that I'm sure is stuck with you for the rest of your life. I'm curious, were there any substances involved in all of that violence?
I don't think on this side of the family, the one thing I'm thinking of now is sort of the sphere of like offloading emotional tension by being abusive is, I wouldn't, it's not quite an addiction, but there's some sort of degree of compulsive offloading to it, in a sort of narcissism type sense. But then on the other side of my family, there was a positive attitude toward cannabis use. So I grew up with it's a nice thing that a caregiver of mine they like it and society doesn't like it. I was certainly primed to disregard any sort of voice that said there's a possibility of having difficulties with the consumption of this specific substance.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely at least in the United States, there's like a cultural idea that weed is not something that people can have a problem with. And if people do have a problem with weed, that the problem is with the person, not with the substance. But it's definitely, it does the addiction thing. It does the addiction dance just like every other substance that exists. So I don't think it deserves a free pass. Like, it does have medicinal qualities or whatever. And it works for some people just like everything does. But for a lot of people, it can be like a really detrimental addiction. Do you remember the first time you ever smoked weed?
So the thing I would add to that was, for decades, such an intense push to legalize it that a lot of the talking points went very strongly. I mean, with good reason in terms of like carceral politics and stuff like that, sending people to jail over cannabis, probably not necessary. So there was sort of a tendency to minimize the negative possibilities and so on and so forth. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think that drug use should be criminalized at all. I think that is absolutely counterproductive and silly. But yeah, I mean, just the idea that people think weed is not addictive, my observation of a lot of people struggling with that is in direct opposition to that assumption. But yeah, do you remember the first time you ever smoked weed?
I definitely remember the first time, and probably, as a lot of people would say, I remember the first time I smoked, and I remember the first time I got high. But the first time I tried it was when I was 16 years old. I was at a party with my old schoolmates. I remember one of the factors was there was a girl that I liked, and there's a possibility that I could have a sort of autism situation going on. Who knows? But I certainly was socially, I've always been a little maybe behind. I mean, or whatever it is, just not up to speed in terms of nonverbal communication and stuff like that. Anyways, that's all to say that I was sort of upset and irritated, and I wanted to fit in, and I tried hitting a bong. It did not work for me. That was also the first time I drank beer. I did get drunk from the 3 beers that I drink. I mean, that's a lot of beer to drink with no tolerance. I've never had that massive draw to alcohol. So there's the first time I tried it. So some of those just teenage not fitting in and etc. and so on and so forth. And then the interesting thing about that is sort of I tiptoed my way towards it. I wasn't a part of the sort of drinking and party culture of my age group and all that. And so I sort of had an introverted path towards wanting to get high and getting high. And it sort of always remained like that predominantly. And I was very big into rap music around that age, 15, 16, massively into hip hop music. And blunts are such an exalted idea in terms of drug culture, and they are made to sound very cool. And so as a tendency, I wanted to try that. But in fact, I ended up building a pipe from some old chemistry equipment that I found at my school or something like that. And I had access to cannabis through my family. I basically would take it without asking from a not so difficult to access location for a long time. I mean, cannabis mainly has been the closest I've really ever come to stealing.
Yeah, so I feel like it's a tale as old as time, and that pretty much everyone that comes on the show has some version of the story where it's like, I felt like I was an outcast, or like I felt fucking weird and I wanted to fit in with my peers. So for some reason, the way to fit in with people is to use substances. Yeah. So I think that totally makes sense, especially as a teenager, to be doing that experimentation with that like very deep desire to fit in. I just want to say that's like really, really normal. And you said you did not get high the first time. How did you experience being high when you actually felt it?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I ended up getting high also when I was 16 with some sort of home-built pipe. I think it was actually from a bucket handle and just like some spare parts that were like lying around. I mean, that's a classic sort of pothead thing, right? It's like building paraphernalia. Anyways, I felt great because I was at home and like I started feeling warm and fuzzy, and I was listening to music on my headphones, and it ended up becoming a sort of ritual that I would repeat 2 or 3 times a week, that I was home alone in the evenings. It's the sad thing about it is there's such a sort of simplicity and purity, I would say, to the emotional world of the 16-year-old human. It feels like there's a host of other options for a person who's 16 to somehow get integrated into feeling good. I mean, the thing is, I had become super depressed. I guess I would say that it was sort of like I was romantically not successful. I just didn't like, there was a lot of, let's say hormonally energy behind wanting to be with someone, and like zero knowledge of how to sort of follow through on that. I would say that's a large part of what really started killing my vibe. There's a lot of things. I mean, I probably should have been doing more sports or something, or like had more of a social life. It's just all of this stuff wasn't, I think I would say there's a certain degree of stricture in my home environment regarding studying and stuff like that. And I don't know, I was like on Facebook and I didn't get out much. My life lacked a lot of the dynamics I would recommend getting outside and stuff like that.
So was the weed manifesting like pretty immediately as a type of escape from all of that discomfort? Because you described it the first time as wanting to connect with other people. And then when you describe actually getting high for the first few times, it's by yourself. Yeah. So we're using it to, just like escape that difficult nature of being a teenager and not fitting in.
Retroactively, I could certainly say that. I don't know how much I thought such a thing through. I mean, it's hard to say because I mean, what's the sort of vibe culturally of like music that has sonar elements and culture? Like I was sort of trying to integrate with that culture to a degree, and certainly, I mean, I probably to feel accepted on a wider scale, in a sort of cultural like disembodied sense, but to some degree, I was trying to feel good. And I mean, I think if you grow up with people who are to some degree using substances, they're going to behave like people who use substances for whatever reason, and like a sort of nurture version of actually having a person who consumes drugs while pregnant with you. Like you're sort of, in a sense, going to be habituated to some degree, maybe possibly, to the idea of like smoking a cigarette or using crack or something like that. But then like the milder version of that is sort of, if you grow up with people who use something possibly to cope or to some degree, I think you're going to be much more likely to try and cope. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that stuff makes sense to me. There's like a constellation of potential genetic markers that have been studied that make people more or less likely to develop an addiction. And then definitely the things that our caregivers model for us are things that we're going to be more apt to try. So I mean, being raised by people who you saw using cannabis products and by all intents and purposes appearing to enjoy themselves. I mean, it makes sense that you would reach for that.
I didn't even see it that much, to be honest. I mean, it's not like I was, I mean, I'd say I had a quite responsible parent using, I just didn't, it's not something that was on my radar. But I think implicitly, if you have a person, for example, let's say maybe, I don't know, they have some degree of rage and they're like numbing it, or they have some degree of sadness and they're sort of smoking to cover that. I mean, this is sort of guessing. I don't know. I don't want to put a diagnosis for other people, but if you live with a person and you grow up with a person and you sort of model, you grow up in that relationship with that caregiver and they're not able to feel something and then they use something, the likelihood that you're also going to go to use something like that seems high.
Totally. I agree. So what happened the rest of your teenage years after you started using weed?
I was feeling existentially bad since I was about 16. So I developed a sort of a depressive self-identity to some degree. I became relatively hardened. I mean, I'm saying like Kid Cudi, like the lonely stoner seems to free his mind at night, that sort of idea. So I got really into smoking every day at around that juncture. And then I started smoking with tobacco in the European style. I don't know. I mean, even until graduating high school, I got great grades. At the age of 19, I got interested in using psychedelics, and that was a influential development in my growing up because I would say it was quite a revelation. I certainly went into it with a lot of gusto and like interest in the psychedelic therapy idea and all sorts of things. And at that age, I sort of got into that.
How did it affect your persistent existential crisis to start using psychedelics?
At that juncture, at the age of 19 and 20, I would say I sort of had a vision, and maybe I had a little too much of a vision. I was really pumped about psychedelics and was like, we can change the world. And it's a mix. I don't want to talk trash about the developments that have transpired, but it's been a complicated journey and it's certainly not over. And I don't know if there will be an end result. I mean, I'm not able to draw a complete conclusion. In a sense, it's been very beneficial and I've transformed a lot. And in a sense, I'm in a much better place, but also existentially in my current life, I'm also in a difficult place, and it's just a lot, and it's sometimes hard to read what's part of what. But invariably, at the age of 21, I had some disconcerting experiences that also involved psychedelics. I mean, to some degree, I think I was incorrigible in a sense. I didn't want to hear what people had to say. I wanted to figure things out on my own, because there's people who tell you, okay, like there's like shamanic traditions and you should work with someone who's like a qualified practitioner. And my thought was like, someone in the jungle like 3,000 years ago, like stumbled on the first ayahuasca vine or whatever, and they ate it and they figured it out as the first person to figure it out as well. And I was like, I can do this too.
Were there negative repercussions to doing it by yourself?
The sort of dynamic that I was involved in would be as a tendency to want to take combinations of things and to take strong doses of things because that seemed like the right thing to do. But at that juncture, I didn't know that. And I just had strange interpersonal experiences. And, there's different words for it. Some people say spiritual emergency, spiritual emergence. Some people say spiritual psychosis. Some people say drug psychosis. To some, I certainly got myself into that sort of situation it's hard to just being in contexts and like taking a large dose of LSD, just being in an unsafe context with another young person who's just into weird young person stuff or just influenced by culture and stuff like that, just didn't have good results. And I mean, as a young person, I was sort of wide-eyed and I was a spring chicken. And there's this strong possibility of getting into some sort of spiritual ideation when taking something like LSD. And then like what I read was the Illuminatus trilogy, which is it's this 70s book by Robert Anton Wilson. And it's this mishmash of, they decided to mash together all the conspiracies that were sort of around at the time, and how it has like sex scenes and like drug use and they're like smoking hash and it's like, super cool, dude. And there's like sort of references to like occultist type stuff and all that sort of. And it's, I don't know, I mean, to a wide-eyed kid like me, who you could probably say was trying to avoid sort of this discomfort of being a human with, a limited, to some degree, thing. I didn't have a lot going on the quote-unquote material plane, in social life. And dating and what the possibility of being like a powerful wizard or spiritualist or whatever certainly was alluring, and I was seduced by things that I don't know I would consider unproductive or difficult, or I got into trouble existentially speaking for years, and I've been having to sort through that for years, all throughout my 20s, and I'm in a significantly better place, but it's like it's still a sort of thing where I hope I'll be really great in like 3 to 5 years or like a decade. So,
oof. Yeah. I'm curious. It sounds like when you were a teenager, there was like depression, trauma from childhood, like a desire to connect and escape at the same time. And then you're also became interested in psychedelics. And what I'm curious about is the difference in between just like a normal spiritual experience while you're tripping and what you're describing as more of a psychosis, and like kind of the details of what happened to you and why you would use some of those descriptive terms like spiritual psychosis or drug psychosis as described of like what you went through.
That's a good question. I would hold the term spiritual experience just very loosely in my hand as sort of a categorization of a wide variety of experiences. I mean, for me, this is sort of part of what you're asking. The idea of spirituality became so charged, and I think it's important to hold a space for the notion that it might be a little more material than one wants it to, like materialistic than one would like it to be, that possibly you've consumed a plant or a semi-synthetic chemical or a synthetic chemical, and it's like docking into all these receptor sites to sort of shift your perception, and that we're sort of culturally primed to associate, or just even the way these drugs can work, where it's like you see like these colored shapes, and at a certain dosage you have so much input on these receptors or whatever, you're getting so much visuals, you can just project whatever you want onto it. And there's all these cultural associations between like Buddhism and Hinduism and like LSD and all this like hippie stuff, right? So just the idea that you just have something docking into your receptors that's just making them work a little differently, and that one might be putting all these labels onto a sort of unquantifiable experience that's happening that we don't have words for, that's sort of moving our neurological experience outside of what I guess they're calling the default mode network. I was in a position where I was primed to believe all of this spiritual ideation stuff, and I think that's what happened to me, that you're just sort of stringing together all these experiences, and then like when you're coming down on something, you might get high on something else in order to like maintain the, to sort of gloss over the fact that it's like not all quite fitting together. And there's certainly reasons why there's proponents of a drug-free spirituality, because sort of the addiction part of psychedelics use can be like, if you're having a spiritual experience when you're taking the substance, and then when the substance stops working, you're not having the spiritual experience as you qualify it anymore. Then, so to some degree, there's a tendency, and sometimes I'm still doing this for certain, to sort of string myself along and sort of to turn a blind eye to some of the more material aspects of, truth and reality in the physical world, and so on and so forth. Does that answer your question? I can certainly say something more about that.
Kind of. So for you, it bridges often to more of the psychosis when you are continuing to use substances to try to hang on to that spiritual state, and when you're denying the physical realities of the world around you. Am I getting that right?
It would be more accurate to say that when I was 21, I had a high dose experience with LSD, and it just became very strange. And I developed the idea that there was something significantly more going on than I had previously considered real. And that's possible. It's possible that that was true, but it's very possible that my neurotransmitters were just, flowing through some different channels, and that my experience in that moment was just so removed from my conventional experience and seemed so vivid in a sensory way that in a sense, I was trying to get back there, not because it felt so warm and fuzzy, but because it created such an impact on my person. It felt so real at that moment. And there were just experiences downstream of that. And I can't quite disentangle it. There might be some sort of metaphysical, invisible substrate that some divine and hellish things are going on. And I'm just, maybe I'll never know.
Yeah, it's just crazy being human and living on Earth and our brains having so little ability to even understand the nature of our surroundings. Mm-hmm. And then, when we try to dip into something more than just the literal world around us, mm-hmm. It's just the options are absolutely endless. I'm curious what the people around you thought about your perception of the world at that time. Did you tell other people what you were thinking and they were like, hey man, you're taking it a little too far? Or did you talk to other people about it?
So what I would add to what I was just saying is that I was searching for something. So I had such an intense experience that was so far from the ordinary that very few regular real life things had a sort of grasp on me, to a degree. There was looking into spirituality and getting high on weed were things that sort of kept that going. And then I met a person who, I don't know, I mean, classically speaking, they were definitely psychologically deranged and sort of psychotic in their own right. They seemed like a sort of crazy wisdom type spiritual teacher to me at that juncture. I've struggled to disentangle all those things that have happened because it had a huge impact on me, but I was quite far out in my internal perception. And it was just a journey of I don't know. I mean, in a sense, I don't know how much regard I had for what other people were thinking. I mean, I guess I was sort of drawn to contexts in which people were thinking similar things as I was thinking. I mean, yeah, it's tough.
A lot of times when we're using substances, we definitely surround ourselves with people that are not going to question mm-hmm. what's going on there. So that makes sense. I'm curious when you realized that things were getting bad for you. Did you have any negative consequences? What was the first time that you were oh, I need to, quit smoking weed or quit doing mm-hmm. psychedelics or whatever it mm-hmm. may have been?
I mean, the first time I realized that I might want to not use the weed was when I think I was 20. Yeah, it was right before I turned 21. That was sort of the first time I looked into it. But the fact is that it was just, it's been a massive journey since then. That was very tentative. And I picked it up within a month after that, and so on and so forth. And there were various...
But what made you question it? What made you think about quitting?
In the situation I was in, things just happened. It was I was in a country with not such a great relationship to cannabis, and I left my stuff out, and I went away, and some people who were taking care, who owned the place where I was staying, they walked in and they're I wasn't thrown out of where I was staying, but I was asked to leave. So the situation was just, yeah.
So it was weed was illegal in the country that you were staying in, and then the people found it and they were oh, well, you can't stay here anymore. And then you kind of thought to yourself, well, hey, maybe it's time to quit.
Very roughly speaking. I don't quite remember the details. I think maybe the dynamic had also just turned to the point where I was just, I don't know, using it all the time, and sort of, I mean, the aspiration is certainly to use functionally and to keep using and just vibe and, do very cool things with your life. But fact is, I don't know, I feel getting high on weed, you sort of end up lying down and stuff like that, and just smoking more and smoking roaches and all that sort of thing. And I mean, I certainly came to the juncture where, at that point where I was questioning it. And I mean,
that would make anyone question their use of substances if they're like, they want to use them to be creative or do interesting things. And then you find yourself just laying down and then like fiending for more. Yeah. So you said that you quit for about a month and then picked it back up after that. How did things go from there?
I mean, that's all still sort of right before the other things we were just talking about. So that's like early days. But I mean, certainly quitting and picking it up again tends to be a matter of sort of easing into it. I was sort of traveling after high school. I had the privilege of traveling for a year, being in Latin America and stuff like that. And so it was relatively easygoing, and I didn't, in that life situation, it wasn't a huge issue. I mean, I ended up, when I was about 22, for example, I was staying with a family member, and like I smoked like a fifth of their sizable stash, and like they noticed and they weren't happy about it. And it was just, I don't know. I mean, what do they say on Marijuana Anonymous, which I have a hugely mixed relationship with. I only really engaged with it now that they had online meetings, I think earlier this year. But the practical aspect of it is you get to hear the stories of like a lot of people who are also sort of compulsively using and having issues with it. That's a very positive aspect. But I wanted to say one of the sort of things is there's like several M's. So like at first, marijuana was a medicine, and after that it was what is it? I forget what it was. First it's magic, and then it's medicine, and then it's misery. I think they have that sort of saying.
Damn.
Yeah. So.
And this was at meetings that you went to?
I ended up quitting over a year ago of my own volition, and I was sort of having a moment where, there's that dynamic of like you quit, and then the things get a little better, but then you need to develop a character or something to sort of keep your life going, because like I don't know, I had this feeling that like, okay, I should be in some sort of recovery thing. And so I looked up MA, and it turns out that there's a huge amount of online meetings. It was a relatively quick thing. It was like in terms of 2 or 3 weeks, I went to a lot of meetings. I listened to some of the speaker tapes, right? Like the presentations where people talk about how they quit. And I was a little upset with it in terms of like, does this really have to be the thing I have to do? Sort of forever be in this like dynamic in these rooms, as they're called. And yeah, and then I sort of ended up looking at materials that were critical of 12 steps and listening to some podcasts, and also in terms of some sort of looking for secular style recovery resources. I ended up clicking on your interview on the addicted mind. But I was saying that for some reason, right? I said it's magic and it's medication, and then it's miserable.
Misery.
Right.
Yeah,
The transition, that transition from it's easygoing and I'm having fun to like, I'm smoking so much, I'm feeling sort of sick. And I'm just going to say strung out. I don't know. I mean, I would say there's some correlation between cannabis and psychosis, which I'm certainly not the only person to say that. And there's certainly data that says that. If you're like constantly forcing your, endocannabinoid system and your nervous system into that state of being really zonked, that suppression of things, I don't think we're built to be high all the time. And I think like, as for example, one way to look at it is like, I think it influences our REM sleep and stuff like that. If you use cannabis, I think alcohol as well. I think a lot of drugs influence sleep, but anyways, if you're not sleeping well and you're getting high, and then like you wake up at like 4 a.m. and you're like, I could get high right now. And then you get high right now. And so you're sort of high all the time. There's just sort of this sort of pressure builds up of like all the normal human experiences that you're sort of not having. So it just becomes weirder. And And right. And so I feel like people often don't report that they're not dreaming actively, that they could recognize. It's sort of, so my sort of take back in the day was like, okay, it's sort of like the things that you're supposed to process while you're dreaming sort of start creeping up on you while you're awake. So you just start getting weird. So it became more difficult as time went on, right? It wasn't as fun. So quitting sort of was more like on the table.
Yeah, that makes sense. How long were you smoking weed for, like 24 hours a day? Like, how long did you do the thing where you would even smoke in the middle of the night?
To some degree. I mean, I quit for like 11 months at some point, and like for 6 months at another point, and like several months, several times. I might have like not smoked for 2 years out of that time that I'm talking about. And certainly I didn't always have weed around, but as a tendency, I certainly did my best to have it around. Yeah.
And in the end, did it feel like good at all? Like, was it still getting you high in any positive sense, or was it just to stave off the discomfort?
I think it's important to certainly give shouts out to the fact that I was in a profoundly dysfunctional state. I mean, people often say this on these interviews. There's sort of like, to what degree are my problems being medicated or caused by my use of drugs in that like deep state of using? Hard to say. I mean, my life overall was in such a, I mean, I would want to say at this point that the experiences I had led me to a point where, psychologically speaking, and I'm pretty far away from that point, even though I'm pretty far out as a person in terms of my psychology and stuff like that. I was much further out, and I was in a place where I was unable to communicate what I was experiencing, and I was very alone in my specific predicament and sort of situation. And I don't think to the outside world I appeared as if I were in a particularly specific predicament. So that made it harder, like in a sort of invisible disability sense, where my sort of over masking behavior is sort of, I am relatively presentable in situations that are formal. I mean, yeah, I might have a hardish time formulating things to some degree or thinking through certain things, but...
Did it feel like misery in the end?
Certainly. I was having a horrendous time overall in my life situation for at least 8 years, just in terms of being in such an unrelatable position, at least as far as I perceived it, and in terms of being able to talk about what was going on, and just being in such a, I guess it depends on who you asked about this, but I think I seemed like a relatively normal person. And for an outsider, it would be relatively hard to say that there was something going on with me or what is going on with me, whilst I was struggling tremendously. And I think as my social makeup is this very, I don't know, it's like stiff upper lippish, or like sort of one thing I'm noticing, and one thing I would say, is that I sort of need to maintain like that I'm doing all right, like to present myself to the outside world as like I'm doing all right, and like I don't, people talk about this in terms of like male socialization and other things. I mean, it's certainly not a male socialization phenomenon only, but the way my personality developed is like I need to act like I'm great and happy. Certainly also that can explain drug use and stuff like that. But yeah.
Totally. I feel like that's really common as well, like trying to save face and like outwardly look like we're keeping it together, even if we're falling apart on the inside. Because a lot of times that addicted voice that's inside of our head, it wants to give us any excuse to keep using. And like, yeah, if you're not having, if you're not in jail, or if you're not getting fired from your job or something, then, and if you appear more or less normal in society, then that addictive part of your brain is going to keep giving you messages like, it's okay, we can keep doing this, even though you said you were suffering for like at least 8 years. I'm curious what it was like for you when you quit.
I wasn't maintaining much of a job. I was doing odd jobs to a limited degree, but I had this one moment where I was a few years ago where like I was high on weed and I had this realization, sort of metaphorically speaking, it was like I'm an alcoholic, like because I sort of had, as a weed smoker, I had like a negative view of alcoholics, as less cool than me. But like practically speaking, that I would spend a lot of time on my own and like be high and sort of have these ideas of cool things or like cool ideas. And certainly the sort of sensory pleasure and sensory enhancement aspect of cannabis. I don't know, you can like make music and it might well sound better at that moment. And I don't know, I just realized that that's very similar to like the idea I would have of like the drunk poet who's like sort of nursing their emotions or like nursing a bottle and maintaining an idea of themselves that's not true. I mean, that was, one of certainly many of realizations along my path. But also, there's various junctures that bear mentioning, but one of the important things is that for about 3 years, I was not working at all and I was really out of it psychologically. I have the privilege of living low to no rent through my family. So I was racking up debt for my mandatory health insurance, which I was not paying and stuff like that. But I was just, I don't know, I got really into law of attraction and, a lot of spiritual stuff and some conspiracy stuff. And this is also like the COVID and post-COVID era. But for about 3 years, I was, so I wasn't working and I had close to no money. I had no money, practically speaking. Like at some juncture, I was like collecting bottles and sometimes to buy like a bag of flour or depending on some food sharing resources that we have in the area, stuff like that. And I would spend a lot of my time in my city collecting roaches of smoked cannabis and smoking that really. And when it rained, I would collect wet roaches and I would dry them in the sun or dry them in the oven and smoke that. And I don't know. So that was a big thing. So I was sort of very much on the margins of, I certainly felt ashamed to some degree. To some degree, I was vibing. I think it's a very like, traversing the hunting grounds and like, foraging for resources is a pretty normal human activity, but certainly I was very much out of it psychologically and in a pretty unrelatable space. And just where I was at psychologically, I have alienated basically my entire social circle of friends I had, say 6 to 8 years ago and before that. So I was in a lonely position. I was for a couple of years, I was part of like a spiritual group. I wouldn't say, I think there's certain like cultic energy to it. It certainly wasn't a cult, but there's a like large group think and sort of, I don't know. I've benefited hugely in my predicament from studying cult dynamics. So
yeah, that's definitely like hardcore addiction behavior, what you're describing, like losing all your friends and being out there just picking up butts and collecting bottles and stuff. That sounds fucking rough, man. I'm sorry you went through that.
I was just lucky to have a place to live, if I hadn't had a place I could live, I'd probably, been on the street as some people are. So there's, I don't know, as a tendency, always listening to like podcast stuff, and you listen to some of like people in the spiritual space. A lot of them do have like these sort of addiction type stories. And I don't know. I've certainly learned a lot. But it's, how far does that go? I don't know. Am I just painting it to be positive? Question mark.
Yeah. So does all of that bring us to your quit date, or did it get worse?
I went 7 years ago now. I don't know. I was involved with this like spiritual teacher guy who's like he was in his early 30s at that juncture. He was as old as I am at this point. I'm like, what the hell, bro? I don't know. But well, I don't know. In terms of the violence that I was confronted with as a child, one of the big things that really was messing with me in my early 20s was like, what if I've sort of taken that on and I have rage inside me that's explosive? And I mean, I did. I do think I've addressed that. I don't know to what degree, but I think to a large degree. I don't know. I was always relatively controlled about it, but I would sometimes like smash a chair. I've smashed relatively many chairs and I've broken relatively many phones, but I was always hugely worried, like, what if I were to hurt a person, which that hasn't happened, but I was always extremely worried about it. And so that was a big thing, because I did end up like breaking a vessel in the presence of another person, and it sort of just came up as a theme, and I was like the way I'm living isn't working for me and I need to change. And I went to stay with this spiritual teacher guy, and I had seen the little documentary about a rehab place that's like it's easy to go there. You don't need to like apply. You can just sort of pull up and then sort of stay there, and stuff gets figured out, and you can get it paid for by the country and stuff like that. So I ended up going there. I sort of said goodbye to everyone, and I sort of packed up all my stuff, and I went to this pretty hardcore sort of self-sustained rehab place that, fun fact for all you recovery heads out there, is it was based in Synanon. Do you know Synanon?
No, what's that?
Synanon is a sort of parallel organization. I don't know if it came from AA or if it sort of developed alongside AA, but they had a huge thing going, I think, in the 40s and 50s, or in the 50s only. And they ended up being very cultic. They were sort of, it seemed like this great thing. And they got a lot of funding, but they ended up sort of living in compounds, and they had like speakers, and they would play like a sort of monologue of like the leader, and they performed they renowned attacks on people who were criticizing them. And like when you arrived, you get your head shaved and stuff like that. It's pretty crazy. It was a drug recovery cultic type situation. Anyways, they had a branch in Europe, and this organization was downstream of Synanon, not affiliated with it for a pretty long time already, but certainly availing itself of the so-called Synanon game, which is a sort of hot seat group thing that is also considered very culty, or as a mechanism of control. I mean, in that context, it's presented as a great therapy technique for the addict, but it basically involves people sitting in a circle, and a person gets picked, and all the other people say, quote unquote, honestly to that person what they think about like their addiction and basically anything, and people start yelling at each other. Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Sounds pretty chaotic. Doesn't sound like necessarily like a healing environment.
It's insane. It's pretty insane. And I mean, so that place where I was, it's a place where people who have the option of people who might go to jail for a drug offense can go there instead. So it's sort of, the milieu is sort of prison adjacent. Certainly few people in there for cannabis, basically nobody. Just alcohol, cocaine, opiates, you name it. So it's a pretty hard scene for a sensitive fellow like me. And did I want to say anything about the Synanon game? I mean, basically look it up, listen to it. It's interesting. Synanon, you sit in a circle and people just, I don't know. I'm not a fan. Actually, the day before I left there was this big, like the whole community, which was like 120 people. There was this large game, and there's like in the inner circle, you had sort of like people were just hashing it out, like yelling at each other. And yeah, I mean, it's a bad scene. I don't recommend it. So that was the thing I experienced. But I was like, if there's absolutely any way for me to recover without being in this place, I would vastly prefer it. I don't know, this was in 2019, and then I ended up in 2020, started smoking cigarettes, and then I started smoking the weed again. And so that sort of led into, I don't know. I mean, I'd want to mention just the sort of up and down and the progressive developments of I think there's this guy, Stanton Peele, who talks about maturing out of addiction, just saying that like a large percentage of people just end up, I don't know, I was working through it. Like there was always this hope, like, maybe I can live a well-sorted life while just getting really high was always the sort of hope. And it always would end up not working out, and I'd sort of quit. And the way I live, I need to like burn firewood in the winter and stuff. So I'd often end up quitting for the winter because I just couldn't sustain that life of activity. But yeah, so it was an up and down with all sorts of developments. And like I said, in the end, I was getting high from stuff I'd find in a tough place. I mean, yeah. The counter story to that is, things were developing, I guess, roughly speaking, in a positive way. I'm certainly in a more better place now than I was. And there was a moment, I don't know if it was like 3 or 4 years ago, I felt like I'd sort of reached the like peak of the crisis, and now I'm sort of on the way down from it in like a multi-year sort of 5-year plan, quote unquote.
Yeah. What did it feel like when you finally quit?
The fact of the matter was, I got sick. I was in bed in last spring. And so smoking tobacco, and then, just the smoking, it was doing, and the extreme chronic stress of being in such a, I just want to, I don't know, accentuate the fact that I was in so removed from sort of regular everyday societal consciousness for such a long time. And I was just in an extreme state of chronic stress. And then just smoking the tobacco and just like inflaming my mouth. I don't know, my gums just really went back in the millimeter range. That's, 30 seconds of an inch or whatever you can call it. So it was bad. That was bad. I couldn't stop. Like, it was like, wow, this is just not going well. I hope I can stop. I intend to stop, were the sorts of things I would think. And then, I don't know, I was sick, and I would quote unquote got this message, or whatever. It was like, you need to quit smoking tobacco now. You need to quit smoking now, or it's going to kill you. That was I'd been sort of working with that idea before that. I don't know. It just, yeah. That's what ended up happening. And I did quit. And I'd been building the muscle of quitting. I'd reduced the amount I was using. I'd quit various times. So it's not like I wouldn't recommend to anyone to like hope that there's going to be like a Deus ex machina moment. Although, to some degree, I can follow along with the AA thing in the sense that there's definitely a juncture where I felt powerless over it. And I was trapped in the sort of machinery of, I don't know, just my origin story. And it was, I don't know, is like, I quit the first time when I was like 21, and I guess it wouldn't have worked without it, but it wasn't like, it just wasn't in the stars or in my cards or whatever you'd say in the books for me to maintain that at that age or in that moment of my life. I don't know. I wouldn't want to encourage anyone to just keep it rolling, to just keep doing whatever they're doing based on that sort of philosophy. But to some degree, things just had to develop beyond my conscious control to some degree.
Yeah. Does it feel different this time?
Yes, certainly. It was, I need to quit smoking, but I thought, maybe edibles will work. But I did edibles, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 times maybe in the months after that. I don't know. I overdid it at some juncture, and I thought my neighbor was telepathically communicating with me to tell me he's really disappointed about like that I didn't clean something up or something like that. That sort of thing. It just didn't. I did it, and then I was like, okay, I'll try CBD. CBD wasn't doing it either for me. So I had to abandon the project.
How long has it been?
It was it's going toward, it's like a year and 2 months, I think.
A year and 2 months. How did you survive the beginning?
I would say I've developed so many resources over the years. I mean, in a sense, I've come so far already from such a bad place. I mean, that helped. Also, just the clarity of whatever it was that prompted me to say I am desisting. I'm actually not going to smoke because because I just can't do it anymore. I mean, it's that. I mean, all sorts of things. It's practice, really, I guess. And just, I'd sort of exhausted most of the other options. I mean, I think that's a large part of it, really. It's like, I don't know, sometimes you like have to lie in bed, and like sometimes you're like really anxious or like angry. And then, I don't know, you have to like go for a run or like lift some weights or talk to somebody or cry or whatever it is. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So from all of the previous attempts at quitting, you had sort of like gathered up a little cove of skills that you can dip into, and you feel like pretty well resourced with that.
It's a mixed bag. I just kept all of my stuff because I was so resolute in, I just had a bunch of cannabis around. I had tobacco, rolling paper, vaporizer, everything for over a year without any incident. And at some point I was like, I want to vape some weed. And so I ended up vaping some weed twice. I ended up getting rid of everything after that. It was weird to go back to it. And then the second time, I actually got high, and then like I actually like actively went to dispose of like the vaporizer and stuff. And I don't know, I was biking, and like every car that I heard behind me, it's like, oh, it's the police and they've come to arrest me because I'm high in a legal place. Just, it was like, yeah, it really took me back to why I don't do it and why I liked it. And yeah.
I mean, sometimes when we go back out, I like how Paul Churchill talks about it. He calls it field research.
I know.
And instead of calling it a relapse, because it's like, yeah, you can try to do the thing that you're addicted to again. Just fucking see what happens. And it sounds like it confirmed it for you that it was not great. And it sort of led right back into like a psychosis where you thought the cops were following you. Yeah. What do you do today now that you're a year and 2 months in? How do you stay sober today?
I mean, predominantly, I just do. I think I wouldn't want to not mention is there's still things like drinking coffee or like cacao or eating too much food or even like microdosing a psychedelic or something like that I do. And it's sort of a coming and going of like, is this working for me? And can I do this? And just, I mean, the like bare bones interaction of, I don't know, wanting to compensate emotional unease or things from my past by just, suppressing them or just moving outside of them, to just create an emotional state that's bypassing it. That's not something that I've just cast behind me. I mean, I don't know. I usually don't drink coffee because it doesn't work that well for me. I've been drinking some coffee lately because it's been kind of okay, but I don't know. Then I had like coffee and I had some chocolate, and it ended up, I was just like so buzzed, and it was like, okay, I guess I tried to buzz away the fact that like I didn't know what to do with myself, and like now I'm buzzed and I don't know what to do with myself. There's 1,000 tools. I mean, so one huge thing that I discovered for myself was just OCD recovery. I don't know if I have diagnosable OCD, but certainly whatever it is that I have benefits greatly from the resources surrounding OCD, because exposure and response prevention is, I mean, sort of the basic theory of OCD is that you sort of have a feeling or a notion and a feeling associated. It would be like something like, I don't know, whatever. And you want to make it go away either by like touching something or cleaning something or by it's very diverse. I recommend looking into it and increasing one's OCD awareness, because it's sort of contextually been reduced to like washing your hands and being a clean freak, which there's compulsions that are just purely mental and stuff like that. And I don't know, there's a lot of that in my experience. And exposure and response prevention, I would characterize it as just sort of letting stuff ride out, refraining from doing the compulsive action. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, there's overlap between that and sort of just feeling your feelings. And I've done a lot of that. I've just greatly benefited from that. I mean, I was doing that before I had heard about OCD and therapy for it and people's OCD stories.
Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
In theory, I had a little list going with some things I wanted to mention. And I mean, I've touched on it really, just how impossible it was to stop at some juncture. I don't know. I perceive a sort of dualism in it, in a sense, like it is possible to stop, and you sort of think you need to keep going at it. And in some degree, you sort of need to let it ride. I mean, I was just so entangled in all of the factors. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's bad advice, like in the right hands, maybe you could quit without, I mean, you talk about it sometimes in terms of the relapse ideation, that like people are like, oh no, now I'm relapsing. Now I'm going to keep using for like months and 3 years and I'm never going to stop. When maybe if people didn't have that idea, then maybe they wouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, a lot of times when we go out and dabble in substances again, especially if we've had a lot of experience with sobriety time, it can be really easy just to plug back into that new way of living. Like, using substances once doesn't mean you have to go spin out of control. It can just be like a bit of evidence, a thing that happened, and then you can refocus back on the new way of living. You know what I mean? And it can be easier and easier and easier to plug into that new way of living. Was there anything else that we didn't get to that you wanted to touch on?
I think we'll just have to leave it at that.
Well, I usually end with the same 2 questions. And one is, what do you think people don't understand about addiction?
How it just sort of happens. I mean, how it's a classic thing for people to respond to this question, but like, no, people don't really set out to become addicted. People just have a nice experience. I assume that, I think a majority of people who get addicted to things don't say to themselves, I'm going to get addicted. I'm sure there's a certain fraction of people that do say that, like, who are in such a bad mood that they're like, I'm going to ruin everything. But most people just have a great experience, and then the slippery slope begins. I mean, there's just that twisting, like changing dynamic of like going from a honeymoon period into just crashing and burning.
It's like it happens before you know it. And then you look around and you're like, whoa, where'd my life go?
Yes. Yeah. It's just, I don't know. And I mean, it's built into the system. I mean, certainly addictive tendencies are being exploited by this is a little tangential, but what I'm a little upset about is that the science of advertising and manipulation is sort of reaching the everyday person, because now a lot of people are doing like their own online influencer type Instagram business, and people are, for like private TikToks, they're using like these attention grabbing strategies. So like everyone's sort of home brewing like the strategies to get people's attention and so on and so forth. That was a little tangent on my part, but
yeah, I mean, there's definitely a severely addictive element of social media. There's no denying that. If you could speak to someone in the darkest days of their addiction, what would you say to them?
I think I would suggest following a sort of dual approach of working on it and letting it ride out. And sort of, if you're currently not working on it, I would work on it. And if you're not letting it ride out, I would let it ride out, because it's a little bit of both. And in a sense, addiction can be considered to be about control, to manipulate your circumstances and the way you feel. And I mean, some of the emotions that have been suppressed for years or decades from childhood, injunctions or things that people told you, there's such tiny feelings that might last like 30 seconds once you get to the point where you can actually feel them. I don't know how I started out saying this, but it's just, getting to that point, I don't know, it certainly felt hopeless to me at a given juncture, and I didn't know where to go, and it feels relatively far away at this point. Even though I'm still in a difficult and uneasy life situation, it has gotten a lot better. And I'm so far away from a moment where things were very dire. And to some degree, I would want a person to forgive themselves for plunging into using. And then, it's just such a big mix of you need to be warm to yourself as well. And not necessarily, excuse your impulse actions. There's just aspects of my personality that allowed me to say, I am going to hide away from everything and use. I have the option of consuming something that is going to transport me away from this reality that I don't like. And I'm going to damn well hide somewhere and make use of that ability and willingly say goodbye to a factual life, even if it might be a detriment. There was a part of me that just said, fuck everything, I'm going to go and do that. There's interesting elements to addiction where or just to life. It's to some degree, we're responsible, and to some degree, we're innocent. There's this thing I heard that they say in karate, in the philosophy of karate, is that there's a sort of prime mover, there's an attack in the universe that came from nowhere. It's someone gave the first punch, and from there you're just defending yourself. I don't know, we're just born into this world, probably not of our own volition to any recognizable degree, but we have to deal with the fact that we do have control of ourselves, and it is possible to develop to have agency, to say, okay, I do have decisions and I can actually make decisions, and I am not powerless over my addiction ultimately.
Yep, I totally agree with that. And the idea that for some reason we're hopeless, I just want to say that that's really common for folks in addiction, and that's the addicted voice trying to keep us stuck in our addiction. And no one is hopeless, no one is too far gone. If I can get sober, then anyone can. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm so glad we had you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've never been on a podcast. It's been thrilling, very thrilling.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Recovery Demystified. If you like what you heard, share it with a friend or rate and review us so we can reach a larger audience. Recovery Demystified is produced and edited by me, Early Brunner. Stevie Petet made our logo. Our beautiful theme music is by Logan Bragg, and our social media manager is Kaylee Bausch. We are entirely supported by your generous donations as a 501c3 nonprofit. You can find a link to donate in the description. May you be happy and free, dear listener.